Today, we are joined by Anne Applebaum, American journalist and writer, author of multiple books and studies of Russia, as well as the Soviet Union and the history of communism. Anne is a Pulitzer-prize winner for her book, Gulag: A History. It is great to see you, Anne. I would like to start with a conversation about Alexei Navalny and his role in Russian history. Who was he, broadly speaking? A man tortured to death in a prison in the far north, and who will he be remembered as? How will the generation to come remember him, if you'll pardon my dramatism?
So Navalny was a really important symbol, I think, not only for Russians, but for people around the world. Just by doing what he did, by making this very brave decision to return to Russia, even after he'd been poisoned, even after he knew he would be arrested, he proved that there are people who have civic courage, and there are people who are willing to defy Putin and the Putinist regime. And that was a very important symbol. It gave people some faith in the idea that there really could be a different kind of Russia, that Putin is not the only Russia. His vision of Russia as a increasingly totalitarian dictatorship is not the only one. And there could be a Russia of citizens. There could be a Russia where there's free speech and there's intelligent conversation and there's civil dialogue. He represented all of that. And I think by murdering him, Putin actually ensured that his legacy and his beliefs and the things that he stood for will be more powerful even than they were.
What is the real impact of his murder, in your opinion? As you've said, it was truly a great sacrifice that he made willingly. But do you think that this sacrifice was not in vain?
So as I understand it, he made that decision believing that as an exile, as somebody who lives outside of Russia, he would never be able to have any influence on events inside Russia, and he wouldn't have the authority to speak about Russia. And so he went back in order to be a voice and in order to matter. Obviously, at the time he made that decision, nobody anticipated the war with Ukraine. Nobody anticipated the crackdown that Putin would inflict on Russia, in connection to the war. And so maybe you can argue now that it was a mistake, but I think from his point of view at the time, it was understandable. He's a patriot. He's a Russian. Being in exile wouldn't have allowed him to speak for Russia or to influence Russia. And so he, at least at that time, thought it was worth it.
Yes, at the time, none of us could imagine the horrors that would ensue only a year after Navalny's return. However, now that he was murdered, will the West's attitude towards Russia change in any way? After the funeral, when we all witnessed how tens of thousands of Russians gathered, prevailing over the fear that the government keeps trying to instill in them, will any of that change the West's attitude towards Russia in any meaningful way?
I don't think the attitude of the West will change towards Russia. As I said, I think there are two reasons why this is significant. One, he showed, and then the people who came to his funeral showed, that there is a different version of Russia that could exist, that there could be a different kind of country. And that's, I think, important for people in Europe and the United States, and maybe even especially Eastern Europe and Ukraine, to see that there are people who oppose the dictatorship. I'm afraid that his murder also reinforced the idea that the Putinist regime is terribly cruel and that it should be opposed. And so, of course, it will increase support for helping Ukraine, and it will increase the belief that Russia is an enemy, and Russia needs to be, or at least this version of Russia, this Russian regime, needs to be defeated because it's a threat to democracies around the world.
I completely agree, but how? So far, nothing has worked, Anne. None of the measures undertaken by the West have done anything to significantly destabilize Putin's regime. So that makes the people that came to Navalny's funeral look abandoned and alone in their fight, wouldn't you say?
So look, it's not my role to tell Russians what to do and how to organize themselves, but obviously, there need to be more people who feel that way, and they need to have a plan, and they need to have a way of acting, and they need to have a way of protecting themselves. Above all, they need to influence people at the higher levels of society who are, stealing most of their money and who are repressing them and who are forcing them to participate in a horrible and brutal war. And they need to convince them, that Russia needs to change. But I think that's Navalny made one attempt. There are a few other people, mostly outside of the country now, who are trying to do the same. But it's really up to Russians to change their regime and to make the Russian state reflect the better version of Russia, the better Russians, the civilized Russians, and not not those who want to, continue to run this kleptocratic dictatorship.
Последнее, о чем я хотела бы спросить.
The last thing I wanted to ask you about, as a researcher of the machine of mass terror which all but ruled the Soviet Union, would you say that Putin's machine of mass repression is similar to that of the USSR? And if so, could we in any way predict where the current regime might be headed?
So for a long time, Putin's regime, Putin's governments did not resemble Stalinism. Putin did a number of things that were very different. He created a system of managed democracy where there were some democratic institutions, they were very carefully controlled, but there was some free speech, there was some free creative expression, artists could paint what they want. He didn't try to establish a system of total control. And so that was very different from the old Soviet system. And he also didn't carry out mass murders. Instead, he selectively murdered people. There would be, occasional acts of violence that would remind people. There would be an arrest of a Khodorkovsky or on a death of Anna Politkovskaya. And that rather than mass arrests was how Putin kept control. Clearly, since the beginning of the war 2 years ago, Putin's Russia has begun to change. And we see a return of something that looks a lot more like Stalinist or Soviet era repression. The arrests of people for saying things critical of the war, even if they say them in restaurants or in private spaces, the attempt to control all public culture, all of academic life, all of artistic life, that's all very new. The person who expressed this much better than I can do in the last few days was Oleg Orlov, the head of Memorial, who, before being sentenced to prison, made a really remarkable speech that anybody watching this program should look for and try and read, in which he described how this new regime is coming, how it resembles the old Soviet regime. He says, and these are his words, not mine, that Russia is moving towards a new kind of totalitarianism, but this time it's a fascist totalitarianism rather than a Soviet version. And he explains in his speech why that is, that the centering of the nation, the destruction of neighbors, all of this is familiar from fascist ideology. But it's moving in that direction. I think it can still be stopped. I don't think Putin's regime is as strong or as coherent as he sometimes likes to portray. But yes, it's true, Russia is heading in a direction that many of us couldn't have imagined, certainly 5 years ago.
If you don't mind, I'd like to ask you one final question. How long do you think it would take Russia to enact change that is going to last?
It could change tomorrow. Dictatorships always look like they're going to be there forever until they're not. They could fall very quickly. All you would need is an elite coup, or you'd need something to happen to Putin, or you'd need, even the generals who are running this horrible war to finally decide that they've had enough of it. They've had enough of losing their soldiers and losing their equipment and losing their army. You could have it change very quickly, or of course it could last for many years. That's really up to Russians and especially to the people in power.
Thank you very much for speaking with me today. As always, it has been a very interesting conversation with Anne Applebaum, British-American journalist, writer, and expert on Russia.